Welcome, everyone. My name is Lottie Poe. This is Recipes for Technological Undoing. Tonight is the second public lecture in the series. I'll introduce the course briefly. This is an extracurricular program that is organized by myself, Lauren Fong, and Alec Mateo. If y'all want to raise your hands real quick. And this is a course that's offered to students at the Reed Field in Semberg. Within this program, we work across disciplines to generate new understandings of how artists and designers can combat techno-determinism. Undoing the structures that seek to quantify, rank, capture, and predict our endless ways of being. Tonight we have a distinguished lecturer, Abeba Birhane, who I will introduce in a moment after a few more thanks. Thank you to the Embodied Knowledge Bureau and Unsettling, as well as Sena and Jung, who made the posters. So Abeba is joining us this afternoon, and she is a cognitive researcher at the Complex Software Lab at the School for Computer Science and the University College of Dublin. Her interdisciplinary research sits at the intersection of complex adaptive systems and machine learning and critical race studies. And she will be guiding us through a semi-interactive lecture this afternoon. Yeah. So feel free to jump in with questions. Maybe you can say a little bit more about the style of presentation.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
But sorry, please help me welcome Abeba.
Thank you. Thanks so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm so excited. I hope you take something from here. And as Ladipo said, it's very interactive. So I'm gonna walk you through. So I have like loosely connected themes that I'm going to talk about. But at any slide or at any moment, if you have any questions, reflections, or thoughts, or anything like that, just throw it at me. As Ladipo said, I work at the intersection of cognitive science, machine learning, AI, and also critical studies in general. So usually my research is looking at large data sets that AI systems are trained on, looking at machine learning models, and kind of like there is a problem there, and just like I'm the problem maker, poking holes and trying to reverse workout, or trying to see the limitations, the problems, and the harms those systems might cause. So today I'm gonna like walk you through a whole bunch of loads of ideas at a very high level, and I hope I can connect them and make sense. I thought that would be better instead of kind of zooming and getting really specific at something really particular. That way, everybody can get something out of it rather than focusing on something specific. So we'll look at. So we'll start with the cognitive sciences, and I'll compare and contrast traditional cognitive science and its understanding of what people are, what cognition is, and compare it to my own, not my own, but cognitive science from my field, which is called embodied cognitive science, and compare that, and then we will then look at how machine learning models, how machine learning people model cognition or people or behaviors, and what's wrong with that. And then we will then look at how those machine learning models of behavior, of society, and of people, how they can be not just wrong, but also harmful and dangerous. And then we will conclude with some ideas and discussions and open questions about what are we going to do about it, because I'm going to show you a lot of problems So we don't have a lot of solutions. I don't have a lot of solutions. Maybe this is something you guys can, you all can help me with. So starting with the traditional cognitive science, a really kind of brief caricature is that it comes from the place of kind of finding a really firm ground of, understanding what knowledge is, understanding what a person is. So this can be traced all the way back to Descartes. Most of you probably are familiar with Descartes. Hands up if you are familiar. There you go. So the idea is he, through his work in the meditations, he went through everything that can be doubted. The senses. You look at this pencil in a glass of water. It looks bent, but actually, in reality, it's not bent. So the senses can be deceiving you. A lot of things cannot be trusted. So he removes everything that's doubted, and he lands on the conclusion that there is something that cannot be doubted, which is that there is something doing the doubting, doing the thinking. So that was his foundation. And from there on, he tried to build a stable foundations for knowledge. And this has implications for not only how we think about what cognition is or what a person is, but also how we have come to do science, how we have come to carry out our experiments. The idea that we firmly place the idea of cognition in the brain or as something abstract means we remove a lot of things as not cognition, like the body. If you follow Descartes' logic, you will end up thinking of the person as something that can exist as a brain in a vat. But in reality, we know, there is no brain in a vat. We exist as embodied beings. We exist as beings that, in a web of relationships, we exist with cultural, political backgrounds. So the implication is that all those things are kind of removed as contaminants or unnecessary problems, as opposed to important factors or elements of what makes us who we are. So following Descartes' logic, what you find is that we think of the person as if they are, they live on their own island, as if they are self-sustaining and rational and static, because we have come to associate cognition with just pure abstraction, with pure thinking, removing all those extra factors. So this kind of thinking about the world, kind of trying to find staticity in a moving world, because nothing is static, we are continually moving and changing, trying to fix a moving thing and trying to find staticity, measuring things might have worked, and it has worked if you are studying physical things, for example, the physical world. But when you try to apply that kind of thinking to understanding, social movements or human behavior, because we are not something that can be fixed and studied and understood once and for all, this kind of logic just doesn't work. And so this is then, Cartesian thinking and traditional cognitive science has faced a lot of pushbacks, and over the last 20, 30 years, new schools of thought have emerged. One of them is embodied cognitive science, which is my own background, which kind of tries to push back against this really reductive and limited understanding of the person, where we are trying to bring in understanding of what cognition is as something that's dynamic, always interrelated, always embedded in history, in culture, in context. Not something that can be fully understood because we are continually changing. So that's the background I come from. So for coming from this background, we are never finished. We are always becoming. We are always changing, and where unlike physical things, it's impossible to predict how we will behave, how we will act, in the long or in the short term, because there is infinite ways that we can behave, and there are infinite factors or triggers, that can emerge from our own interactions. So the takeaway message is that human behavior and social systems are, in principle, unpredictable. You cannot predict these things because of the factors I tried to explain. And this has been pointed out not only by embodied cognitive scientists, but also from a subcategory or of the field called complex science or complex systems thinking. It has been laid out really clearly how, scientifically speaking, you really cannot have a precise model, a precise prediction of human behavior because of all the factors I mentioned. And again, from the people from the embodied cognitive sciences, if there is anything we can be sure about, it's the fact that we are full of inconsistencies, we are full of ambiguities, and our environment and our interactions are continually changing, but also really messy. So this makes, but just a little clarification, you can say we have habits, we have, patterns. So what do you mean that we cannot be unpredictable? Yes, there are we don't just, go out in all kinds of directions. We do somehow behave, there is some kind of predictability. We do organize ourselves based on what's culturally expected, based on our own habits, based on our own backgrounds. So we can still acknowledge that. We can still say that there are patterns to our own behavior, to our own interaction, but that doesn't still mean that we can build an empirically, scientifically precise model of behaviors. And as I'll come to it, these social norms and backgrounds and cultures that helps us form patterns, that helps us, that directs us into some kind of, habits, usually are filled with, social stereotypes and cultural norms that are steeped with, historical inequalities and structural, structural oppressions and structural constraints. So, coming to modeling, so within embodied cognitive science and complexity thinking, human behavior and social systems are often referred as complex adaptive systems because it's impossible to predict them. So when we come to machine learning models that are, that are building predictive systems of how, communities might behave, or there are so many real-life applications. For example, if in hiring, if you are going to apply, when you send your CV anywhere, it's very likely that it will be there will be a machine learning model that sifts through your application before it gets to a human being, or before it even passes to the next stage. When you are out, walking, there are various technologies and machine learning systems that you interact with that are constantly categorizing and rating and classifying you. so coming back to my point, so when we face, or when we build those machine learning systems, we are predicting, say, a successful candidate or anything like that, means we are much more likely picking up what has in the past, or what has historically been a successful candidate, rather than really getting at any fundamental truths about someone's sufficiency or someone's qualification. So moving straight to machine learning models, we can think about it in terms of data and the models itself. This is to emphasize the point that when we are building these models, when we are making predictions, especially, so the more you move to the physical systems, say if you are predicting the weather, maybe it might be slightly different. Or if you are predicting something less ambiguous, we will get to it in a bit. It might be different. But the more you veer into the social, say predicting success of job applicants, or predicting recidivism, which is that whether someone will commit crime or not, or anything like that, the more we veer into the social sphere, the more any patterns we are picking up are patterns of harmful stereotypes rather than anything. And this can be reflected both in the data and in the models. So I'll give you a couple of examples from my own work. This is from a large image dataset called Tiny Images. It was curated by MIT professors, and it has been used for over 10 years to train and validate machine learning, computer vision machine learning systems. So myself and my collaborator did an audit work, which is like poking around and seeing what's actually in the data set. And what we found was that, for any subcategory you look at, the data really reflects socially and culturally held stereotypes. So this is some of the findings. You search the data set for the N-word, you find images associated with the N-word of black people, and you look at images for the B-word. We have thousands of examples, as you see on the graph. Our work was the first to kind of critically examine the data set, and following our work, MIT apologized and withdrew the data set from use. But the point is that, any data sets that you collect from the public, you collect from the social sphere, ends up reflecting harmful stereotypes rather than anything. And another example is, I worked with large data sets that, especially towards, especially lately. And another data set that has just been released a few months ago, and our paper came out maybe like 4 or 5 weeks ago. This is a huge data set. The Tiny Images was only just 80 million images. This one, when the data set was released, had 400 million images, and the data set is growing by the second. So at the moment, I think last I checked, it has passed over 20 billion image and text pairs. Again, myself and my collaborators, we looked into the data set. It's huge, it's massive, it's impossible to look at it. There is no practical way of looking at it, because even taking a tiny slice of it and interrogating it takes you so much time and effort. But we took a tiny slice and we looked at how the data set represents various concepts, various cultures, various people. And as you can see, when we typed African, what you find is a really cliched, tired image of what African people look like or tribes look like. But you type European, on the other hand, there is not so much stereotyping there. And we have to blur a lot of the images because the images were troubling and they had scenes of pornography. I apologize in advance. Here is more example. We searched the dataset for beautiful and a lot of images of naked women or images of women taken from pornographic sites came up. Whereas you type handsome, that's not the case. The same goes for CEO. You find, what do you imagine when you think of a CEO? Maybe not you, but for most people, it's like a white man in a suit, right? That's exactly what we found in the dataset. It really embodies typical representations. And then we type terrorist. You don't see white supremacists or Proud Boys or whatever. You find, again, people that look like from Middle Eastern origin with depicted, again, as depicted in the social world. Any comments, questions? Am I going too far, too fast, too slow? All good? Yeah, okay.
I have a question. I'm curious about the data sets and I guess how you're able to access them as a researcher or what they're like, what's the umbrella term for it? Is it owned by a particular company? How do the images come into this?
Yeah. So usually, large data sets exist everywhere because that's how face recognition systems are trained and distributed and operate everywhere. That's why we have technology everywhere. So we need data sets, huge data sets to build these models, to train these models, to validate these models, for these models to function. However, these large data sets are usually hidden by, so these large data sets usually exist in like big corporate labs inside Facebook, inside Google, inside DeepMind or whatever, or in private companies. I don't know if you've heard of Clearview AI. They are a US kind of AI enthusiasts, let's call them, that kind of gathered and curated this huge data set, and they were doing all kinds of dubious stuff with it. So these kind of data sets are usually, they're just inaccessible for researchers. So we have no way of, so in the case of tiny images, because it's a research data set, we were able to access it. It was open access. We have other data sets such as ImageNet, which I will get to. Again, because these are research data sets, researchers can access them. But these ones that are like either by private companies or big tech corporations, we just don't have access. So these guys, they are all guys. These guys, a few months ago, they were like, we are frustrated with these secretive data sets. So we are going to replicate big data sets that are, state-of-the-art big data sets that exist in Google or Facebook or OpenAI, and we are going to make it open access for everyone so people can use them to train or build their own AI systems. So they assembled these data sets and they made it open, and we came across it. I first came across it on Twitter, and of course I was like, yes, great. So we have these large data sets are being open now. It's a good move. It's a good progress because if it's open, you can go look in. But the more I looked, the more I was really troubled and disgusted. This was a really emotionally taxing work. I really struggled. I had problems of all sorts, including, unable to sleep because the data set was really, really problematic. It has all kinds of things which is difficult to mention in a lecture hall. So the data sets became available for researchers because the curators thought they were doing something great by recreating what exists inside corporate labs and opening it up for everyone. So in a way, it's good because now we have an idea of what datasets inside corporate labs look like. So that's a good improvement. But on the other hand, it's also really troubling because we now know what these datasets look like and how they represent concepts and people and cultures. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Okay. Any other question? Yeah.
How, because those other data sets are proprietary and therefore closed off, how, does anybody know how closely a data set like this resembles a corporate data set?
That's a good question. We have no way of knowing, but we can infer and we can extrapolate because OpenAI, which is champions this kind of AI research. They have various papers that give you a clue about what pre-trained models they used, what techniques they used to collect data, and where the data was gathered from. So you can kind of put 1 + 1 and kind of infer, but we don't know. But it's very similar we anticipate, or we think anyway. But unless companies like Google really open up their data sets, we have no way of knowing how closely this data set resembles the ones in corporate labs. Yeah.
I have a question. I was wondering if there's any data sets that have opened up and made it possible to add images for other people.
To add images.
Yeah. Is that possible? Or does it exist to have an open data set where people, other people can add stuff?
I don't know of any initiative, but there might be some. I don't know of any initiative. Usually people are shocked and when they find that a picture they put on Twitter or Instagram or whatever has ended up in a data set. So usually people want their images to be removed because this is also not just a question of technicality. It's also a question of legality, regulations, because there are various laws, especially in the EU, that is supposed to give individual people rights to withdraw their data, to use their data any way you want. But when your data is taken without your consent, without your awareness, and it ends up in a data set, it ends up being used to train AI, to validate AI. That's on the verge of illegal, but because all this is new and the law is still forming and emerging, it's a really gray area, and I'm not a legal scholar, but usually I don't know of any initiatives that will ask people to add their images, or my experience is also people just not being shocked and not wanting their images to be in the data set and wanting it to be removed rather than. But I think that's a good idea. Instead of just taking people's images without their consent and awareness and building a data set, it would be good to actually if people want to volunteer their images, then people can build data sets based on consent. That would be much better than the current practice. Yeah. Any more questions? Okay, we'll move on to models. So it's not only data sets that, instead of showing us, telling us any ground truths or anything fundamental about the nature of people or social systems, it's also models, AI models. So this is an example. This model came out, I think, about a year ago when the paper was released. It was supposed to be state of the art. You can go play with the model, upload your image. So the first row is an image, like the raw image of myself, and the model kind of scrambles it up, and it depixelizes it, and the idea is that the model can rebuild what you might look like based on the depixelized image. So the idea is like, you don't have, if you give it a really low quality image, it can then it can then predict, and it can show you what that distorted image might look like. And as you can see, after my images were distorted, when they are being rebuilt, it really has a really whitewashed, racist, colonialist ideas of what I'm supposed to look like, or what beauty is like. This wasn't the case for other people, especially white people, because that's what the system is trained on white images. So it worked relatively better. Whereas when you are, outside the status quo, the way you are rebuilt ends up adhering to the status quo. So,
what's the model called? How is it called, the model?
I can't remember. I can dig it and I can share it with Lapido. They had to withdraw the model because a lot of people were outraged because I wasn't the only one that was showing the problem. There was a lot of other people, so they withdrew the model, so you can't experiment with it anymore. But the paper still exists if you want to read the paper. On models, again, another limitation or problem is that we are not predicting anything fundamental, anything real, because we have no way of knowing what features or what factors of the data is being picked up by a model. So this is a really recent paper where they fed this deep learning model with so much medical images and scans, and they were shocked to then find out that the model was associating, it was predicting race, even though they had no idea how it happened or what it means. They still remain unclear. But the point is, we just don't know what happens. And we end up, picking, again, harmful stereotypes. I know you'll find this interesting, maybe the most interesting example. So again, myself and my collaborator worked on another data set called ImageNet. Anybody aware of ImageNet? No, it's okay. It's a niche world over there. So ImageNet is one of the best, or the gold standard for computer vision. It's the best state-of-the-art image data set that there is, that's used for research to build computer vision models. We also looked at ImageNet, and we found that there are a lot of non-consensual images, images of naked women, images of children, not at the same level as the Leon 400 million dataset I showed you just a bit earlier. ImagineIt has much better standard. It's much more monitored and maintained, but still, ImagineIt still had various problematic images. So myself and my collaborator used an app called Art Breeder. Yeah, do you know it?
I feel like I've heard of it.
Yeah. So it's a generative neural network where you can give it, some images, and you can tweak the parameters a bit, and then, you can be creative. A lot of people create generative art using this app and other apps. And we didn't train it. It was a pre-trained model. We gave it some of the images from ImageNet, images of bikini, images of brass and comic books, and we asked it to generate an art, and this was the result, which we thought was interesting because the art that's been generated ends up reflecting the input image, which is, bikinis of women in bikinis and in brass. Any thoughts on this? Okay, we'll move on, maybe. One more example of how AI models, again, end up, just picking up harmful stereotypes. Anybody aware of GPT-3? It's a language generating model, a large language generating model. Yeah, okay, so GPT-3 is currently one of the best state-of-the-art large language model. It's owned by OpenAI. So the idea is that you have this model that has been trained with like thousands and millions and billions of texts to kind of learn how language works. And you can give it a prompt, and it will generate sentences or paragraphs or whatever texts for you. Again, I went in and experimented. You ask it, what's the problem with Ethiopia? And the sentences it generates is very much typical to, stereotypically held European view, cliched stereotype of Ethiopia. I'm from Ethiopia, by the way, originally. And you ask it questions like, what are women? It gives you, again, it generates sentences that reflect social held stereotypes. It's the same through and through. So these models are really problematic. And as I said earlier, the more you veer towards the social and the cultural and the political, the more in trouble you are, the more dangerous your model is. It's not just a wrong model, it's a model that has real implications, real impacts on real people. And just to mention, I would call these kind of models as not just wrong models, but also dangerous models. So models that try to kind of predict emotion, models that try to predict gender, or models that try to predict criminal behavior or trustworthiness. There is no scientific grounds for them because this is not something you can scientifically verify, and because things such as criminality, gender, emotion, trustworthiness, dishonesty, they are not something that can be read from faces, from expressions, from body movements, but they are cultural constructs. They are they have cultural norms built into them. They are something we understand through context. They don't have a physical characteristics, or they don't have a biomarker or anything like that. That's why any model that's built that's trying to predict these things is really dangerous. Just to give you an example, because these models are becoming very popular, there is so much money going into sponsoring them. You have, for example, especially with COVID now, because everything has moved to online, to the virtual, even exam assessments are being monitored by AI systems or machine learning systems to monitor students' attentiveness, to monitor students' honesty or dishonesty, whether a student is cheating or not. So these are things that are happening, that are being implemented, and that are getting more and more popular. That's why it's important to point out how dangerous these models are. So this is me kind of doing a little play, making meme. So, back in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, when eugenics was at its heyday, you had people trying to figure out, whether someone has a criminal tendency or whether someone is trustworthy or whether someone has a good personality or not, using, by measuring the skull, by measuring the nose, the forehead, everything like that. But then, gradually, especially after the Nazi genocide, which was aided by this kind of pseudoscience, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, we come to realize that this is absolute pseudoscience. There is no absolute scientific grounds for it. And we gradually dropped it, and pseudoscience became, a taboo. People, it wasn't respected anymore. You are just discarded as not a scientist if you kind of worked on this area. But unfortunately, now that we have machine learning models, people are claiming again, forgetting the fact that what they are doing is similar to what has happened back in the heyday of eugenics. In a way, we are resuscitating, we are bringing back long discredited pseudoscience. So I mentioned this. So as I said, the more you veer towards the social, the less scientifically valid and the more morally, ethically troubling your work is. So you can think of these three broad categories where you can have models of, say, perception or object detection. Recognition is another issue, another matter. Just object detection, detecting if you have an image, you can train your neural network to identify whether there is an object, whether there is a bottle or not on the table, whether there is a face or not in an image. That kind of work is slightly more scientific because you are unlikely to get it wrong if you are just detecting whether something is there or not. Another example is Shazam. You all young people use Shazam, right? The app where you can have, you might have a little bit of a tune, and then the app can kind of trace and identify the artist in the song or whatever. So that kind of work is unambiguous. You can correlate and coordinate and find the right answer. It also tends to be less morally troubling. It also tends to have less ethical implications. Automating judgment sits somewhere in the middle. But the more you veer to predictive policing or predicting whether someone is going to be a good hire or predicting whether someone should get welfare benefit or not, or predicting someone's gender or emotions or anything like that, the more you veer towards this, the more you are absolutely dealing with something unscientific. And this has been, there has been work proving this again and again. This work, I think, came out about a year ago, where 160 teams of machine learning experts tried to predict children from low-income families. They tried to predict their trajectories, and of the 160 teams, none of them were close enough to even the benchmark. Another aspect is that as we are making predictions, prediction itself is like a self-fulfilling prophecy. We influence the outcome. So in a sense, predicting plays a role in making something happen. So whether it's, Netflix recommending you based on what you have watched, here is what you would like, or Amazon, based on the books you have bought, here is what you bought. In a sense, it's shaping you and directing you in a certain way. So those recommendations, those predictive models are not just models, but they are also forces that shape our being, our cognition towards certain directions. This is a bold example because Facebook is probably one of the most secretive big techs because it's impossible to have access to anything, any of their data, any of their models, any of their studies. They actively kick researchers out that are doing research, that are doing work on their platform. But they came, last year, they published their own research where they themselves admitted that 60% of the time, people that join that join terrorist groups, extremist groups, are directed by their own recommender systems. So recommender systems do influence people's behavior.
So in a way, they start thinking for us then.
Sorry?
Well, they start thinking for us.
They start thinking for us.
Yeah. If we already accustomed to some of the things they give us.
Yeah, Facebook?
Yeah, for example. But
Yeah.
just commercials or something.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly.
I'm familiar with, it's easy to handle. Okay, probably good. It's easy. It's safe for me, and I go on with it. But this shows that it can also.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And it could be good, but it's also important to remember these big tech companies, they are not making recommender systems to thinking or caring for you or what's good for this person. No, they are a business model. They are here to make money. So their recommender systems are designed in a way that maximizes profit for the company. So they don't have anybody's interest at heart, but their own interest, their own business, their own models. As we've seen throughout the examples, whether it's hiring algorithms, whether it's predicting criminality. Have anybody heard of Amazon's hiring algorithm that was withdrawn about 2 years ago? 1 person, okay. Yeah, 2, good. 3. So I'll give you a brief kind of a brief description. So what they did was they trained a model using 10 years of past history, 10 years of who Amazon hired to kind of build a model and to predict who they should hire, who is likely to stay, who is likely to be a good employee, who is likely to fit in the company. And when you look at their past history, their 10 years, people they have hired are very homogeneous. They are usually white, cisgendered European men. And surprise, surprise, the model started to reject CVs from women employees, even if you have woman written in your CV, like one of them was captain of women's chess club or something like that. So CVs were completely outright rejected. And this came through from a whistleblower. The thing about these algorithms is we don't hear about them because they exist in secret, and we hear about them through whistleblowers, through various drips and drops of information. So after the whistleblower, Amazon discontinued using the algorithm, but they are using something else, and who knows what that is. So these algorithms have implications because they don't just stay in the lab. They don't just stay inside corporations, but they are built and they are integrated into the social systems, and they are applied to to decide people's lives, basically. And when you look at the recurring theme when algorithmic systems go wrong, it's usually people that are at the margins of society. Not usually, always people at the margins of society that are the most impacted. So we have a medical algorithm that was still used in the US, across the US, to decide who should get medical care. And they found out that it was discriminatory of black patients. And another research found that online advertisement doesn't recommend high-paying job towards women. So women are impacted. So many studies. Trans people are impacted. Older workers are excluded from, again, job advertising, I think. Immigrants, people of color, women, LGBTQI, children. The recurring theme is that people at the margins of society are the most negatively impacted by these systems. So we might say that, going back to, our discussion about how everybody's responsible, how we exist in a web of relationship, we are all connected, and things emerge from our interactions. It might be easy to say these algorithmic systems impact everyone, and we all have a responsibility to kind of direct them in a way that's more equitable. But it's also important to remember that there is a huge power asymmetry. People that are developing and creating these algorithms are of very homogeneous group that are at the top of the hierarchy, whereas people that are being impacted, which is the majority, have very little say in never mind how algorithms are created, even whether their image data should be included in a data set or not. And this is another paper with collaborators. We looked at 100 most influential, highly cited machine learning papers from two premier top conferences called NeurIPS and ICML. And what we found was that the most highly influential papers don't really care about injustice or fairness or anything like that. Their values are, does it perform? What's the performance? What's the accuracy? What's the efficiency? Does it scale up? Is it state of the art? Is it novel? And things such as, autonomy of the person, respect for persons, fairness, or user influence, or anything like that, were at the very bottom of the 100 most influential papers we looked at. Only 2 of them mention negative impacts of their work, even though we know much of machine learning system that's applied into the social world has negative impacts. Only 2 of them of the 100 papers mentioned it. One of them just mentioned it in passing, not even in detail. So this is just to show you the asymmetries. So just to give you a quick recap, when we make predictive models, unless we actively make an effort, they do end up, kind of perpetuating the status quo. They are inherently conservative, and they often and most of the time impact people at the margins of society. And these systems, these machine learning models, the cost and benefit and harm is unevenly distributed, while big tech companies and machine learning engineers make the most benefit, people at the bottom of society face the most harm. And so these are all I've been throwing problems at you. Usually I talk about these things to, machine learning experts, data scientists, or whatever, and they all, at the end, people don't, even when you write papers, people don't like you pointing out problems. So you have to come up with ways forward or solutions. So I'm used to thinking, how do we what's the best way forward? But this crowd is not that. That also wants an answer. That also wants a way forward. So I will just leave my suggestions for how we can move forward. And I would really like to hear from you, given that I have shown you so many problems and I have thrown so many negative things at you. Yes?
So from what I understood in the beginning, you bring up the idea of human complexity and then present the relatability of these things. But then I'm wondering how probably how realistic it is to think that code itself is a language that can, inhabit all of these complexities. I think that there's a lot of progress that is being made in layering information and not making it biased, but I'm also just wondering in general how code in itself can represent this non-logical way of being. Because maybe there's just, as you said, it's just no tech to deal with these problems because it's just irrealistic.
Yes, that's an excellent point. And the million-dollar question. How do we represent complexity in code, or can we? Yes?
Just out of curiosity, is there any AI model or automated machine learning model that you like? Or that
I struggle to find an answer to that. I'm also taking part on a panel that wants to chart the future, that wants to focus on positive technology, that wants to dream and think and be creative about how technology can be used for, in equitable way to create a world that benefits the least impacted. And I'm struggling to come up. I'm supposed to come up with a list of things, of positive things, of technology. I haven't found any. I really want to find some because I don't like being a pessimist person. And I want to leave you with something positive and optimist. Maybe I'll keep thinking. Yeah.
I'm just thinking, do you think that, for example, creating models that would be specifically oriented towards, for example, local or national, would maybe be already more helpful? Because I'm wondering, for example, I'm researching a bit into femtech.
Yeah.
And
yes.
How they're trying to target women's and menstruating health problem as a whole, when it can be actually quite problematic to make sense of everybody's problem.
Yes.
And so, for example, with menstruation, it is experienced and lived differently from a place to another. So in that sense, doing it one way to feels already more. So I'm wondering with what you're describing here, it may be also making it more
local and contextual.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a really good point, and I also share this idea that the more you stay local and contextual, the more you incorporate background and history and context, the more helpful and valuable your technology is to those specific people. The more you move away from context in tech speak, the more you scale up, the larger scale you become, the more it's just vacuous because it's just too abstract. It cannot be applied to anything or something specific. So yes, exactly. So you can think of like scale and context as, on a continuum, on opposite side, and the further you go, the bigger the scale, the more harmful and the less helpful. The closer you stay to context and concrete things, concrete people, concrete objects, the more helpful. And you can also see problems, you can spot problems. When you have like huge, massive scale, you don't even know what's there. It's just too difficult to navigate. Yes?
It's also interesting in the beginning we discussed like how AI is influenced from like Cartesian models of cognition, not embodied cognition. And
Yeah.
it's interesting that also in terms of input of what a human is,
Yeah.
it's an image of a person. It's not sensory input, it's not biological input. I don't know if that could also go to a very dark place.
Yes.
But for example, like what constitutes a human in itself?
Yes.
For AI.
Yeah, I hear you. It's like, so that's an open question that doesn't have an answer because there is no one has a definition of what an AI is. What artificial intelligence is probably the most contested subject, the most contested term, because the experts themselves, they don't know how to define it. Nobody has an idea of what intelligence is, what artificial is. And never mind how AI understands what a person is. There is,
but it is reflective of what information we see valuable in Western culture, right? Like what kind of image, like a person with a floating head devoid of a body, let alone identity.
Yes.
The totality of the body. So in that case, right? It's like we have flat images that are.
yeah.
But yeah, because I know that I'm curious. I don't know if you've encountered other places where I don't know, or experiments where embodied cognition has been applied in some way to like algorithmic thought or.
So there is like people working at the intersection of embodied cognitive science and trying to create technology that is not reductive, that tries to embrace all this messiness, ambiguity, inconsistency I mentioned, as opposed to kind of narrowing things down and putting people in a box. But at the moment, that remains a theory because code itself, machine learning system itself, inherently in its nature, is something that has to be formalized, something that has to reduce things down. So in a sense, this idea of creating a technology that embraces and that embraces this messiness, this ambiguity, stands in contrast to current machine learning systems, at least as it's currently constructed. But there is lots of theory on that, but no actual systems, no actual technology. But we remain hopeful. Sorry, you had a question, right?
Yeah, it may be connected.
Okay.
Is there any speculative attempt to make like machine learning algorithms that have some sort of values? Because it seems to me that this idea of this is a neutral, rational algorithm that just collects information will, as you say, always ends up like replicating conservative ideas and the existence.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't know if that can even feasibly work.
Yeah, so as far as I know, so there are people, as I mentioned, at the intersection of embodied cog-sci and machine learning trying to work on that, but a lot of it is theoretical. But in the field of machine learning and AI, nobody cares about that. It's all about larger scale, more performance, more efficient, beating state of the art. So who cares about if you are understood well or not?
No money.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
I was listening to the program that you showed this example of the linguistics when it comes to Ethiopia.
Yes, yeah, I'll go back to it. Yeah. It's by a large language model called GPT-3. Yeah. Yeah, just GPT-3. Yeah, no problem. So their model used to be open source, partially open source. So you could go and kind of prompt it, put words and see what comes up. They have closed that down again, unfortunately. So you have to pay to experiment. But there are similar other models, large language models, maybe not as you know, state of the art as GPT-3 and not as good as GPT-3, and not as famous as GPT-3. But if you kind of look around, it's possible to find large pre-trained language models where you can kind of
I'm not even sure about what I'm going to say now.
That's okay.
We're talking about solutions for the tech itself.
Yeah.
The tech. But I think that what we see now is what's happening with the tech is a reflection from the paradigms of the makers.
Mm-hmm.
They make their stuff within their window of vision, within a time, but that is what it lives within that certain spectrum. But that to me shows that we are not really looking for, of course we're looking for change within the AI, within the development, but deeper down we're looking for a linguistic change in ourselves, and a change of perspective.
Yes.
And that's what I personally research.
Yes.
What can be a catalyst for that? I just think that it's very connected.
Yes, I agree.
Like a superficial layer.
Yes.
And like a very deep down layer.
Yes. I agree. I agree. So that's one of the things. So when people realize that, there is a racist element to, medical diagnosis, or there is like discriminatory element to, recommender systems or online job advertising or whatever, people immediately go and like, oh, let's debias the data. That's just like, excuse my language, that's bullshit, because you cannot debias your data set. People try to come up with kind of superficial solutions, as you described them, try to find a really narrow technical solution to fix that problem. But as you said, the bigger solution, if you want to call it, remains much deeper. It requires mentality change. It requires how we think about these systems. It requires, cultural change about how we navigate this space, what kind of language we use, how we treat these AI systems. But that's a lot of work, and it needs a lot of time. It happens gradually. You cannot just come up with it just like you can come up with a technical solution. And it's difficult, so nobody wants to hear it or go near there.
Let's go there.
Yeah. Yes, let's go there.
Maybe I'll ask about, because I was looking at your Twitter and I saw there was something that you put out in the world that had a really polarizing response from people that were in the data science professions. A comment on data and its inherent politicality to the numbers itself.
Yeah.
I'm sure you know what it is.
I say so much stuff on Twitter. Most of it is just nonsense.
There is no such thing as unbiased data,
Yeah.
and never can there ever be. And just that statement alone, some people were just like...
Yeah, a lot of people didn't like that, yeah.
Yeah, so...
Yeah.
maybe going into like the problem of education and how computer scientists are taught that their ways of seeing the world are objective and inherently, there's no problem we can't solve.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And it's not just computer scientists, it's many people who, who work in various research areas.
Yeah.
They have a really reductive and weird notion of what a data is. So to me, data are something that represents reality, right? And reality is a moving target. So when you have collected a huge data set and try to kind of nail down how women are represented, or Africa is represented, or trans people are represented, or whatever, your data goes out of date really quickly because our ideas, our representations of those concepts is moving. So people think there is like an objective world out there that you can just capture in data, and bias is like your data is not aligned with that objective thing, so you try to align it, But there's like, what your data is really a snapshot of a moving target. That's why you can never have unbiased data, because the reality itself is continually moving and changing. So even if your data keeps updating every second, it cannot capture that reality, because also there are so many multiple different ways to capture that reality. You captured that moving reality in one frame, in one sense, doesn't mean you have captured it from all kinds of perspectives. And to capture something, a representation from all kinds of perspectives, while also maintaining its dynamicity, its continual change, is impossible. We go back to complexity science again. For complex adaptive systems, the best, most accurate, and true representation of a complex adaptive system is the system itself. Because when you try to replicate it, you have created something else. It's not the system. Because these systems are not something that can be fully captured once and for all. So I have explained it way better here than on Twitter. I didn't bother explaining it on Twitter. It's like, do your own research.
But I think with your prompt at the end where you're trying to figure out like a hopeful AI, I think it's anything that can remind us of this.
Yes.
That what is being output is only relevant to a particular perspective, to a particular moment.
Yes.
And that it can
yes.
sort of constantly changing.
Exactly, yeah.
Seeing kind of some of the ways in which these algorithms are mobilized, and having like recently encountered some like post-Marxist thought, and especially around the realms of like reproductive labor, and the idea of like the spheres of the economy that are kind of set aside for recreating workforces, recreating cultures, recreating institutions. It does seem like it's very purposeful, this idea, that it's not, exactly, I think to the points that were made, that it's taking on that role of reproductive labor, these algorithms are taking on, and in a way almost it would seem replacing what might be understood as non-objective cultural institutions, something like this, but obviously these are not objective systems, but still framing them within an affect of objectivity, so it's like fit within neoliberal conceptions of society and whatnot. Not really a question, but just something, I don't know if this kind of parallel between what would be considered reproductive labor and the role of these algorithms, if that's been explored anywhere.
Yeah. I don't know if it's been explored, but I hear what you're saying, and I agree with you. Maybe something parallel or similar to what you're thinking might be, work around micro workers, ghost workers, who are, so when we talk about like building models or curating data or creating data and then like feeding it to your model, it makes it sound straightforward, but there is so much dirty work that goes behind the scene, and one of them is for any machine, if you are training, say, convolutional neural networks or anything like that, for some AIs, you don't have to prepare your data. For systems like that do through reinforcement learning, you can just like the data can kind of make learn something from it, learn labels or whatever. But for much of machine learning systems, there is, so the data has to be prepared, the data has to be labeled. So this is where maybe a lot of the labor behind AI goes. So you have Amazon, for example, has a huge workforce called Mechanical Turks. So when AI works, it's the Mechanical Turks, or it's the people that are exploited and underpaid that make sure that the AI is fed, the correct label, and data has been indexed properly, and that, when the model makes an error, it goes straight to a person to fix it, to validate it, to correct it. So you have continually people that are kind of put aside and ignored, even though they are really central for any AI system to function. AI can't function without that kind of cheap labor. Mary Gray has a book called Ghost Work, so she calls them ghost workers because you don't hear about them, you don't see them, even though they are a crucial element of the AI pipeline. So we forget about all these. Yeah.
I get the impression that AI is a sort of, like artificial intelligence is a sort of dangerous fantasy that, like, you talk about algorithm, your last slide talks about understanding.
Yes.
Versus predicting.
Yes.
But, an algorithm can't understand.
Exactly.
By its nature, so,
exactly.
Therefore,
exactly.
we're dealing with something that's like, you can see how it's used as a weapon, and this maybe the suggestion that it can be de-weaponized. But
yeah.
Personally, I don't think it's possible.
Yeah. So as you rightly noticed on the last slide, one of the solutions I have to come up or I have to propose is like, inherently, when people build machine learning systems, it's for making prediction. It's for predicting this pattern or that pattern. So, the idea is, I proposed in one of my papers, is that let's do less prediction and more understanding, because we don't understand what we are predicting. We have these patterns, we find these, patterns, and we just, feed it into a system and we try to replicate, or we try to kind of predict the next set of patterns. So the idea is instead of using these patterns to predict the next set of patterns, let's slow down and understand, or ask, what do these patterns mean? Trying to understand those patterns. That's one of the ways, but again, that doesn't really align with the core values of machine learning, so it doesn't get that much uptake. But yeah. Yes.
It's more like a thought on a flare, but I was kind of thinking about what was said in a chapter about creativity.
Yes. You read my paper.
Yeah, I read
Thank you.
the more this becomes, how do you say it, more ingrained in your society.
Yes.
Or the less an individual can, or maybe the less you can think for yourself. And I was kind of thinking about how this may, the more technology becomes important in our society, maybe the harder it will be to change our society.
Yes. Yeah, I agree, yeah. This is the thing about predictive systems. They partly create what the future looks like. So the more they are involved in creating the future, the less flexible the future becomes, and the less agency we have in shaping it in the direction we want. That's what you meant, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very scary. There is a question from the online audience.
This was streamed online.
Yes.
But I told you.
They have the camera, right?
Okay.
AI is processing this.
Okay.
Saeed Yafli is asking, suggestion algorithm in social media is leading to people stick to their beliefs and their biases. What's the alternative for it?
So that's a really good question, but I think, should I speak through the camera? You can think of it that way. These algorithms, leading people to their biases, to ways, towards, perspectives that confirm their own biases. But you can also think of it a different way, which is, from the perspective of people building the algorithms, because that way the onus is not on individual people trying to confirm their beliefs, because here, in this case, individual people have, much less control, much less agency, much less say into how algorithms are designed, how they are developed. This goes back to the power dynamics I talked about earlier. So it makes much more sense to talk about to think in terms of hierarchies and to talk about how at the top hierarchical level how those things are designed to lead people a certain way, to shape people a certain way, rather than thinking of individuals kind of finding ways to confirm their own biases. Because I like to kind of remove the onus on individual users themselves and put the onus on the people designing and creating these algorithmic systems, if that makes sense. Hope that makes sense. Yeah.
I have one remark, and maybe that's unrelated to what we discussed, but I just sometimes have to think how popular culture and like cinema and series kind of opportunities like fascination for technology and IA in the way that it really distracts from what it actually really is.
Yes.
And in a way, I had to think like maybe of older movie or books production that were really much more concerned with what it was going to be, and now that it's there, I don't know, it feels like sometimes, as you say, you have like 1 or 2 articles popping about how terrible it is, but it feels like the fascination really takes over the real concern.
Exactly. Yeah, that's one of the big problems with defining AI, because a lot of the public discourse is laid by fantasy and sci-fi ideas of ideas from movies of what AI is supposed to look like, whereas current state of the art AI that's currently operating is nothing like that, and you will be surprised how brittle and how frail and how easily current AI systems break. You spend most of your time trying to make something work as opposed to it working immediately. So they are really full of problematics. They are continually fooled, they make mistakes, and but what we currently have is nothing like what we fantasize or what we imagine or what we see in sci-fi movies or in fantasies. And that's thinking of AI in terms of from like in a way that we have seen in sci-fi movies is part of the problem of why people have a really overhyped and inflated idea of what AIs are capable of, when in fact they are not capable of much. They are stupid usually.
I'm curious more about your perspective of like changing things from the inside as a researcher, maybe that's working for Google or Facebook. Obviously, it's contradictory to their aims as a company. Like, to what extent do you think it's even possible, or if it's worth the battle?
Me personally, I was in DeepMind. It's a company, a sister company with Google, for 5-6 months, and I can't say much about it, but I mean, it's important to work towards solutions both from inside big corporations and from outside, because you need all kinds of perspectives, you need all kinds of solutions and ways of thinking forward coming from all directions. So I'm not saying working from inside big companies is the best way to advance solutions. I'm not saying working from the outside is the best way either, but we need a combination of all. We need people from inside, from outside, from policy, from regulatory. We need general awareness of individual people about AI's capability, about their data. So I don't think it's a good or a bad thing. I mean, I will draw my line. For example, I won't work for Facebook, for example. but that's, a really thin line between, DeepMind, Google, and Facebook. So I might come across as a hypocrite. But I also won't say, I won't work for tech companies either, because I don't think that's a solution. That's
Maybe another question. If you had all the funding you could ever get, what is like the kind of research question you would maybe want to carry out, or what team would you want to build?
As
well?
Oh, the things I would do. I have ideas, and I hope they materialize sometime in the future. So I won't say much, just not to jinx it.
Sure.
But I will obviously have, multidisciplinary team from all fields, and work on things that I'm passionate about, things I've been working on.
Cool.
Yeah.
Any other questions or reflections on our own work, if maybe anyone's exploring these themes in your personal artistic practice? Or
I somehow think the first goal of dealing with all the funding that you could dream of would be to set up a system for protecting all the funding
Yes.
you could ever dream of.
Yeah.
And sort of keeping that money train rolling, just a sort of knee-jerk reaction to what people might even subconsciously decide to make. But, yeah. Just throwing that out there.
Yeah.
I had a bit of a curiosity from your intro, so it's maybe a bit removed from our discussion on algorithms. But when you introduced your work on embodied cognition, and you described like the impossibility of being within a vat, like this figure of the brain in a vat, kind of stuck with me a bit. And I had in my notes something like vat as body or something like that. And I was just curious at teasing a little bit at this divide that you drew on, like when is it the thing holding it not a body, and what, like essentially is there a difference? Wouldn't the vat be a form of embodiment in that light? I know it's maybe a bit.
Oh yeah, I mean like a vat, not a bat. A vat, like a container.
Yeah, like a vat. That's
the thing. Yeah.
So I mean, if it's containing, it's just more a question of where we draw the line on embodiment.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe you are veering towards the sci-fi realm where you can have a body plugged into like silicon or metal or whatever. Again, it's a philosophical question. We can contemplate, we can entertain, but for me personally, and as far as current AI research goes, that remains firmly in the sci-fi world, far from reality.
And I would say that's also to perceive the body as a container, in the sense that the body is porous, the body is interconnected to other bodies, it's interconnected with its surroundings. And if it's in a vat, then it's a container. Like I think that's the essence of the word, the vat.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
The brain is not really vulnerable to any sort of external input.
Yes, exactly. Very well put. You have articulated it better than I could. Yes. Yeah.
it reminds me, the other week we went to the Hortus Botanicus, the botanical garden here in Amsterdam, and one of the things that we heard about was when all of these plants were being collected from the Dutch colonies at the time, like there were so many that died right away because they were removed from the pollinators, the insects, all the things that also make this living, flexible thing what it is.
Yes, exactly, yeah. Exactly.
Like you can't draw a line that this is a plant, this isn't.
Exactly,
this is a plant
yes.
within its environment, within its climate, within everything.
Yeah. That's precisely how systems thinking thinks about, the environment-agent symbiotic relation. It's like there is no clear line between an agent ends and environment begins. It's all like it morphs smoothly from one to another. Yeah. Okay. Any more thoughts? Yes.
Yeah, Yes, I'm wondering how maybe there can be ways also to make this knowledge more, let's say, because now you talk about writing papers, I haven't read the paper, but I'm just thinking of within my family, is a lot of scientists, and I feel like they can so hardly see the critical insight of these things. Like my dad is a data scientist in a hospital, and he really thinks that AI helps. Helps a lot with figuring out where to place patients first, depending on what they have. And of course, putting articles on the table demonstrating the bias, the racism, etc. Sometimes, feels like relevant, but also, I don't know, it feels like for the experience that I have of being in such an environment that deal with the materiality of these things. They don't seem to be such like self-awareness or criticism, and I'm always wondering how to bring that in a way that it doesn't sound like, like throwing sticks, but constructive criticism or how.
You've described how I feel every day being in a computer science department.
So what are the coping mechanisms?
It's a constant struggle. I mean, over the years, throughout time, you change minds. Also, your mind is changed. Again, it's a symbiotic relation. And you have. I like to think I have some impact, and things are changing at a really tiny scale. But also, it's not something one person like me can implement a change just all of a sudden. It's not like that. It's like, as you said, it needs a really culture change. It needs a change in attitude in how we think about these things. Exactly, yeah. So it takes time, but we do our bits. We work together. We continually interact, and you write papers, give talks, and discuss things with your colleagues, and it's all part of the process.
Last couple of questions or comments or reflections?
Reflections would be most welcome.
Well, I'm curious about the upcoming talk that you have, the one where you are maybe to present the ideas.
It's a panel, and the idea is to kind of chart, a positive, forward-looking future that embraces the positivities of technology. So, any help with that?
Well, it's strange that it centers the positives of technology as opposed to the positives of ourselves, our beings, and is it? I don't know. Maybe you can kind of pull it back into that direction.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, that's interesting.
But thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And maybe I'll ask quick, either Lauren or Alec, to give a shout out to our next event, which is next week. We just have a workshop that is on automated poetry and reading. So.
Yeah, we're actually going to be playing with some models.
Oh, good.
Seeing if we can train some text models and play around with the logic in it. A bit of a hands-on exploration of the consequences of some of these logics. Hopefully I can make it. Next Thursday.
Yes. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. And I love this. Oh, they have gone.
Yes.
I love this so much. Thank you.
We're going to see if the designers are